You say you don't support reparations. Why not?
Not everybody suffered equally. I mean, when you go into slavery, it's much more complex than white people were the oppressors and black people were the victims. If you dissect it, you will find there were about 3,700 free blacks who owned 12,000 slaves, black slaves. The question is, do the descendants of those free blacks who owned black slaves, do they pay? Blacks really benefited more the first 100 years after slavery than we have in the last 50 years. I was born in 1937 during the Depression. Everyone in my small, low-income black community, 98% of the households had a man and a woman raising children. Elderly people could walk safely in that community without fear of being assaulted by their grandchildren. Never heard a gunfire during that time. Never heard of a child being shot to death in the crib. But there are 50 children today who have been shot and killed in our cities. If you're talking about remedies, we've got to look beyond saying that every solution has to have a winner and a loser, that blacks can only benefit if whites lose. We have to be defined more than just victims of oppression. When whites were at their worst, blacks were at their best. When we were denied access to hotels, we built our own. We have to communicate to our people the history of how they achieved in the face of oppression. But if we continue to sit back and say all of the challenges that we face in out-of-wedlock births of violence, that somehow the control of that is in the hands of white America, and therefore until white people change, there's nothing that we can do. This sets up a terrible situation for this nation. The big crisis facing America is not racial. It is the moral and spiritual freefall that is consuming our children. The highest death rate among black families is homicide. Among Silicon Valley, the highest level of suicide, 6 times the national average. In Appalachia, there are prescription drugs. And so if we are to address this crisis that is causing our children to lack a sense of personal responsibility or value for their own life, they will take their own life or take someone else's. So in order to address that, we must come together and look beyond race and realize America is drowning because it's in a moral and spiritual freefall. None of us should be defined by the worst of what we were in the past, but we should be defined by what we want to become in the future, and that people are motivated to change when you give them a vision of victories that are possible, not constantly reminding them of injuries to be avoided.
Everyone was a slave, everyone.
The Slavic slave trade was largely dictated by Vikings, known as Varangians in Eastern Europe, the Byzantines, and nomadic polities like the Khazars, Volga Bulgars, and Hungarians. The majority of slaves from Eastern Europe were sold to the Islamic Caliphate. Slaves played a primary, but not exclusive, role in securing the privileged economic position of Western Europe going into the late Middle Ages and beyond. The fact the West did not use a lot of slaves in the Middle Ages, but traded them, created a massive trade surplus for Western Europe, which paved the way for later Western European economic expansion. The steady increase of Slavic slaves in the 7th to 8th centuries was nothing compared to the 9th and 10th centuries' explosion of Slavic slavery. This explosion of Slavic slavery in the 9th and 10th century can be attributed to multiple factors. The first and most important factor was the establishment of the quite rich Islamic Caliphate, which had a huge demand for slaves. Second, unlike in the South or West, political power in Eastern Europe was still very disjointed, meaning it was much easier to raid the numerous Slavic tribes and polities for slaves than more established larger kingdoms. Third, the newly consolidated Frankish Empire, even though largely moving away from slavery in favor of serfdom, was in a perfect position to not necessarily use the slaves they captured on their eastern frontier, but sell them into the Mediterranean slave markets. Fourth, considering that by this point all the major religions forbade the enslavement of people adhering to the same faith, the still largely pagan Slavs proved to be the perfect source of pagan slaves. Lastly, fifth, the emergence of the Viking raiding and trading network in the 9th century opened up new trade routes in Eastern Europe through which Slavic slaves could be more easily captured and sold to Byzantium or the Caliphate. The Slavic slaves captured by the Bohemians and the Franks were mostly sent to Verdun, which was a major medieval slave hub where many of the Slavic slaves were castrated. This was mostly done to prepare them for the Islamic market, which preferred eunuchs. It is also prudent to mention, if it wasn't obvious already, that not all medieval slaves were Slavs. Slavs constituted the majority of the medieval European slave population, not its entirety. Enslaved people were often recorded as captivus or servus or both, plus an ethnonym, e.g. servus captivus vel or captivus sardus. After a while, especially if the slaves being captured and sold in a particular area were regularly the same ethnicity, these written records became abbreviated to just the ethnonym. So, in areas like in early medieval England, where most of the slaves captured were Welsh, the Latin word for Welsh, Wale, became for a bit synonymous with the word slave. Same thing happened in medieval Genoa with the ethnonym Sardus, meaning Sardinian, and with many other ethnonyms in other slave trading areas. However, there was one ethnonym to rule them all. One ethnonym that would not only become synonymous with the word slave, it is where the word slave comes from, and that ethnonym is Slav, or Sklavos in medieval Latin, or Sklavos in Byzantine Greek. Slave traders made no ethnic distinction when selling and buying. In other words, Slavs weren't more likely to be enslaved because they were Slavs. Slavery based on some kind of perceived race or ethnicity didn't really exist in the Middle Ages. Slavs constituted the largest number of slaves because of their economic, political, geographical, and religious situations, not because of their quote-unquote race. In the 11th and 12th century, when Hungarian, Polish, Rus, and various nomadic polities were more firmly established in Central and Eastern Europe, the Slavic slave trade didn't stop. Wars among these polities provided a supply of slaves. The life of a slave during the Middle Ages was heavily dependent on where they ended up, but for the most part, the kind of slavery present in 19th century Americas wasn't really common in the Middle Ages. Most provided means for them to become free, and most allowed a lesser or greater degree of assimilation into the dominant group. This is not to say that they weren't treated poorly, they most certainly were. After all, the survival rate of castration in medieval Europe was quite low. However, it is important to give some point of reference as to the scale of the treatment compared to something that people might be more familiar with.
Before Africa, Russia was the main hunting ground for slaves. The word slave comes from Slav, since Slavic people were often captured and sold into slavery. Crimean Tatars did most of the slave hunting raids. The Crimean Khanate, a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, was the main player in the Black Sea slave trade. 1 to 3 million people were taken as slaves from the 15th to 18th century. The raids devastated entire regions. Villages were burned and thousands of peasants taken as slaves annually. In 1783, Catherine the Great annexed Crimea, ending the Tatar slave raids. The Tatar slave trade influenced the development of serfdom in Russia. The serfdom system of Russia was just another form of slavery. Serfs were indistinguishable from slaves. But unlike slaves, they could only be sold with the land they were attached to. The word serf in Russian literally meant bonded peasant. During Tatar raids, many peasants sought protection from Russian nobles or the state, agreeing to work their land in exchange for safety. Over time, this turned into legal bondage, serfdom. Even though Russia successfully ended Tatar slavery, serfdom in Russia had already become deeply entrenched. Russia kept millions of its own people in bondage for centuries. Serfdom was abolished in 1861, 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation of Lincoln.
The Irish slave trade of the forgotten white slaves. Human cargo transported on British ships bound for the Americas. They were shipped by the hundred.
The number of whites, for example, who were enslaved in North Africa by the Barbary pirates exceeded the number of Africans enslaved in the United States and in the American colonies before that, put together. But nobody is going to North Africa to ask for reparations because nobody is going to be fool enough to give it to them. Slavery has been a universal institution for thousands of years, as far back as you can trace human history. And what we're looking at is if slavery is something that happened to one race of people in one country, when in fact the spread of it was around the world. In 1776, which is when Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, as well as when the United States got started, he said that Western Europe is the only place in the world where there is no slavery. And even the Western Europeans had vast numbers of slaves in the Western Hemisphere, yes, but not in Western Europe itself. And so if you're going to have reparations for slavery, it's going to be the greatest transfer of wealth back and forth. The number of whites, for example, who were enslaved in North Africa by the Barbary pirates exceeded the number of Africans enslaved in the United States and in the American colonies before that, put together. But nobody is going to North Africa to ask for reparations because nobody is going to be fool enough to give it to them.
Original slaves that came to America were white.
Women, mainly prostitutes, but all sorts of other people as well, who were taken out of the Bridewell prison in London in the early 1600s and sent off to the new colonies in America as brides for the planters, if you like. So these were women of marriageable age or of breeding age or whatever, who would be sent off, because up until then, of course, you had a brand new colony, it was all men, and for this to become viable, they needed women.
It was children, it was convicts, it was prisoners of war, it was all sorts. It was also people who signed up as indentured servants to get to America free of, they didn't have to pay the passage, the poor. They would be contracted, indentured by merchants and by captains and by planters' agents to go to America free, in return for which they gave up their rights to their labour for several years. It was supposed to be, according to history, it's 4 or 5 years. In fact, it could be as many as 12. And what they didn't realise was that they were signing away all their rights, and they had become chattels. They were used as property, regarded as property. Now, it was also something which refuted one of the great ideas, one of the key ideas of the development of slavery, which is that in 1619 slavery began in America with the arrival of 20 and odd Negroes, as they were called, sold, according to accounts, by a Dutch captain to planters in England, and this was where slavery began. Well, it wasn't true. Slavery had begun earlier. Children and women and convicts had been sold earlier than that, and although a small number of Africans were subsequently brought to Virginia and sold over the next decades, only very few, only 350 years later, 20 years later. But meantime, hundreds, thousands of poor whites were being brought in, and on various convicts and children, etc., and they were being enslaved.
Man, get in here, get in here, get in here. I got one of the biggest secrets I've been wanting to tell for a long time about these people that came to Ellis Island and what they was running from. If this secret don't blow your mind, my name is not Getty. Look at the date. Pay specific attention to the 19th century, right? You paying close attention. Now, what they was running from, go and take a screenshot. North African slavers. They was running away from the Africans. A diverse group that included peoples with dark melanin skin participated in the Barbary slave trade and enslaved white peoples from Europe. From Europe. Go ahead and take a screenshot. Go ahead and take a screenshot. And all these groups was enslaving the white peoples from Europe. But who saved their ass? Who saved them? Now watch this. Watch this. Who saved them? Who saved them from slavery or from the Africans? Go and take a screenshot. The lack of widespread public knowledge about African Americans participated in the first Barbary War to liberate white captives from the Barbary slave trade. Wow! What? Look at that. Go ahead and Look at that. Black people's... Go. Hey, oh, let's continue. Now, what I told you to pay attention about that date, right here, the 19th century, I told you to pay attention to that, right? Now, what I tell you, pay attention to that date. You see them? They coming as the slaves got freed from slavery, and the black peoples brought them here because they was the slaves, and they told you was the slaves. Black people brought them on a boat to protect them from the Africans because they was being enslaved. Do you see it? America's maritime history, the black soldiers. Look, we the ones who was driving the boats. You see them? Look at that. We the one was taking them to America. They did not want to go back to Europe. They stayed here and caused trouble for us and enslaving us, poisoning us, trying to put us in slavery. Did you catch that? But if you'd like to donate $1 for this wild secret, I greatly appreciate it.
About to really fuck y'all up with this one. Did y'all know there were so-called black slave owners in America? This is a census record from the 1850 slave schedule.
Hey, you probably don't know this, but a large majority of slaves that came from Africa during the 1600s were white.
Ask me about it.
All right. Apparently some Pan-Africans have problems following instructions. So, like I said when I was on the panel, how many African slaves were brought to the USA? 305,326, just like I said. So I don't know where you're getting this whole 12 million from, but I guess if you go over here to the total number of slaves transported worldwide, you get 12 million. So that would be Spain, Portugal, Great Britain, Netherlands, USA, France, Denmark, and then you get all the totals. But once again, what does it say for the USA? 305,326. Learn to follow instructions and stop trying to twist the data to support your Pan-African theory that all so-called black people were brought from Africa to the Americas.
All 13 colonies. This is going to blow y'all away. I'm telling you, this is going to rock the world, okay? All 13 colonies had rich black people in those colonies, rich black people, families, wealthy black families, in all 13 colonies, and they all owned slaves, white slaves, not black ones, white ones. Yes, it was indentured servitude, okay? But they lived on the black man farm, and they worked for the black man. And the only difference between a slave, it don't matter, you're still a slave as long as you don't, you can be a slave either way, but you're still a slave. But the point that 13 out of 13 colonies, all 13 colonies had black people own white slaves. Sure did. And they worked for them. Imagine that. Guess, when the Civil War was over with, the black rich, like Robert Johnson and that black woman in Louisiana that had all those slaves. Yeah, she had over about, I forget how many slaves, she had about 400 or 500.
Return of the Ancient Ones.
Telling y'all, man, they've lied to us about everything, my brother. And I'm not mad at the black man for this. I know I'm blaming this on the devil and evil people. Because it never bothered me. I don't care about color. But the fact that 13 colonies, out of all 13 colonies, there were rich people, black people in every one of those colonies that owned blacks and white slaves. I told y'all, we've been lied to. They want you and I to kill each other so they can control the country and dumb us down in school so we don't never learn our history. You know why we don't know anything about it? Because they hid it from us. Our politicians, the left, right. Can you imagine all the black backlashes fixing to come from this? They've lied to us about everything, black and white. Satan is the prince of the power of the air. And remember, the love of money is the root to all evil. Remember, mammon? Yeah, all the rich blue blades, I know who they were. They were blue blades. They were the rich merchants that come over here and settled, or they were already here, because there was a lot of black rich families in this country in the 1500s. So it was. And most of you chief and Indians were black people, or black color. I don't know what tribe, but they were blacks. They looked just like them. But they were Indians, so-called. And all the Indians had white slaves. The blacks had white slaves. The white men deserves an apology, don't you think, in the South? Because I'm fixing to pray about it. Amen.
Slavs, the Slavic people, the real slaves. Let the truth be told worldwide.
These whites were slaves for life long before blacks ever were. And this white slavery was even hereditary. White children were born to white slaves, and they were also enslaved. Whites were auctioned on a block with children sold and separated from their parents. Wives were sold and separated from their husbands. Meanwhile, you had free black property owners walking the streets of northern and southern American cities, while white slaves were being worked to death in the sugar mills of Barbados and Jamaica in the West Indies and in the tobacco plantations of Virginia. So the establishment has created this misnomer of indentured servitude to explain away and minimize the fact of white slavery. But if you really read even the establishment
When they got there, they were given a new story, the official version of history. No elders left to tell them the truth, nobody to remember how things used to be. It made them easier to control, you see, easier to accept the new narrative.
Every time I bring up slavery, somebody jumps out of the shadows like, did you know black people owned slaves too? Like, that's supposed to stop the conversation. Like, that's the gotcha. Okay, so let's talk about it. The first recorded black slave owner in the American colonies was a man named Anthony Johnson. He was taken from Angola in the early 1600s, survived indentured servitude in Virginia, gained his freedom, and eventually owned land, over 250 acres. That's wild, considering the time, right? But here's where it gets twisted. In 1654, Johnson went to court to claim that another black man, John Casser, owed him a lifetime of labor. And the court sided with him. And just like that, chattel slavery was legally extended. Not by a white man, but by a free black man. This is the part that people love to throw in your face without a shred of historical nuance. So yeah, Anthony Johnson was the first. And yes, over time, some other free black people, especially in places like New Orleans and Charleston, they owned and enslaved people too. Sometimes to protect family members from the system, sometimes to gain wealth and proximity to power. And no, hell no, I'm not excusing it. It was betrayal, it was cruel, it was wrong. But I'm also not going to sit here and let you pretend that that canceled out 400 years of white-led genocide. Because here's what you're not going to do. You're not going to erase the fact that 98% of enslaved people were owned, traded, insured, and brutalized by white people. You're not going to pretend that black people created the boats, the laws, the markets, and the damn system itself. Black participation was a stain, but white supremacy was the blueprint. And let me give you one more twist to that Anthony Johnson story. After he died, Virginia snatched that land back from his family. They claimed that black people couldn't be citizens. So miss me with that fantasy that owning people bought him safety. The very system that he tried to participate in turned around and ate him whole. So yeah, some black people tried to mimic the master. But that doesn't make them the architects. It makes them proof of how poisonous that system really was. They weren't trying to build freedom. They were trying not to drown. And in doing so, they passed the chains on. We don't hide the truth over here. But we damn sure won't let you weaponize it either.
You ain't gonna believe this. So this black man had white slaves in the 1800s, outsmarted the whole Wall Street, got rich off a fire that destroyed half of New York, and fought off a whole white mob that tried to lynch him. So the brother name is Jeremiah. Now before you start thinking this some fairy tale about black excellence, let's get this straight. This man was not a saint. He was a menace. This dude wasn't asking for a seat at the table. He was flipping the whole damn table over and buying the building it was in. Now let's rewind to the early 1800s. Jeremiah born in 1806, and Haiti is fresh off the Haitian Revolution. And this kid learns quick. If you want to survive, you better learn how to outthink everybody else. And boy did he. His first hustle, counterfeit coins. He got caught slinging fake currency, bringing them from New York to Haiti, and ends up getting chased out of Haiti by a French warship. Yes, an actual warship. That's how wild bro was coming. But that was just Act 1. Fast forward to the 1820s, Jeremiah shows up to New York. No money, no connections, and no mercy. And remind you, this was around the time when blacks couldn't even walk freely around the city, let alone into a bank. See, around this time, Wall Street was a powder wig white boy's paradise until Hambleton showed up and crashed the party. And get this, he didn't just join the gang, he started making his own rules. First move, maritime insurance. Bro turned that to a gold mine. He brought insurance policies on ships and cargo, and then mysteriously some of them ships.
There is no way to hide the fact that white people owned black people. There's no way to hide that.
Okay, Whoopi. In the US, there were many whites and even blacks who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest to slave owners. There were thousands of blacks in the South that were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts, and an estimated 1/3 of the free persons of colour in New Orleans were slave owners, with thousands of these slave owners volunteering to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Sources there, just in case anybody's curious. Many black slave masters bought up black slaves to grant them freedom, but many more bought black slaves because they saw them as a cheap source of labour for their own agendas. In Louisiana, Maryland, South Carolina and Virginia, free blacks owned more than 10,000 slaves according to the federal census of 1830.
Being a slave does not mean you came over on a boat. We were enslaved in place. Sharecropping was farming your own land, but paying the white family that lives in your house most of your harvest money. Slave means Slavic. Slaves were hairy white people.
Of all the arrivals in the American colonies were white slaves, and they were America's first slaves. These whites were slaves for life, long before blacks ever were. And this white slavery was even hereditary. White children were born to white slaves, and they were also enslaved. Whites were auctioned on a block with children sold and separated from their parents. Wives were sold and separated from their husbands. Meanwhile, you had free black property owners walking the streets of northern and southern American cities, while white slaves were being worked to death in the sugar mills of Barbados and Jamaica, in the West Indies, and in the tobacco plantations of Virginia. So the establishment had created this misnomer of indentured servitude to explain away and minimize the fact of white slavery. But if you really read even the establishment historians, if you read their footnotes, even they have to concede, at the very least in the 17th century, that black slavery was almost non-existent, and that whites were the overwhelming majority of slaves in America in the 17th century.
Where does the word slave itself come from? Isn't it exclusively in reference to the experience of black people in bondage?
No, it isn't, Pastor Peters. Actually, the word slave derives from the white nation of people known as the Slavs, or the Slavic people. And they were enslaved longer than the entire history of the United States. The Slavic people were slaves about twice as long as blacks were slaves in North America. So the actual definition of that word pertains to the experience of white people in bondage, yet the politically correct historians tell us that we're not allowed to refer to whites as slaves. So it's really a huckster's game that's at work there.
It's that old wordsmith game, isn't it?
That's correct.
Okay, so once again, when they said we were in a plantation, this is our freaking land. The plantation belonged to us. Of course we were in a plantation. We are agricultural. We are farmers. This is a spiritual practice to us, and we call it the Azaka. Cousin. That's why now some of us call each other cuz, okay? So that's what naturally farmers, because food was sacred. We value plantation more than anything, okay? So therefore, this is when now they are stealing our crop, stealing our farm, and they turn us to what we call prisoners of war. So from becoming prisoners of war, their job is to force us to teach these indentured servants that we call the new workforce, to teach them how to cultivate these land, to teach them how to run the land, and 2 years later they unaliven us. So they were doing that. So this is where a lot of these whitey people they bring as indentured servant was actually help us free. This is how we actually become Maon. Mahons, what we call Maroons of today, that mean we run away. These were the runaway. When they talk about runaway slave, it was never us. We were the runaway POWs. There's a difference between Slav, because the Slav stays. The Slav was the indentured servant. So when they start out there working with us, because we have to teach them how to cultivate the land, so within some time we develop friendship, and within time they understand we are in the same predicament. Both of us was used by others. And now let me say what were the others. The others were none other than white and black. Let me remind y'all once again, the people that was brutalizing people, they were white and black. So you understand that it's just a culture problem. See, the people that got here as Ottoman, the Ottoman Empire was black people. Okay? And also, northern part of Africa, they called them Slav. They called it the Empire of Ottoman. The northern part of Africa was known as the Afrikaners. These Afrikaners is what they call Berbers today. These were whitey people, okay? So they both come together to do a damn dirty job. So you understand race was never an issue, but they understand if you introduce race today, it'll be forever for us to fight each other, but both sides was doing this. It was a culture problem. You have an American culture versus an Islamic and religious culture. Let me say this again. It was a culture problem. The America, we don't deal with religion.
Challenge right now. Show me a picture in Mexico from 1900s of any one of y'all look like this. You won't be able to find absolutely nothing. This is how Mexico used to look like. These are the original Mexicans. These are what you call the Guerrero people. That's why in the area you call Guerrero in Mexico, you find more so-called black Mexican they want to call African. No. So you want to call these people African? Do they look African to you? No. Do they dress like African to you? No. You got to have cotton to do shit like this. Shout out to Earth, man. You got to have a shitload of cotton to make these clothes. That's why cotton grew wild in America. That's why our clothing style was so extravagant, because we were dealing with cotton. That was our shit. We have cotton in abundance. That's why our clothes was looking so fucking dope like that. As opposed to other place else, cotton don't grow the same. That's why they told you the largest industry was corn and cotton here in America. Damn right. That's why we were so fly like that. And that's a fact. Now that's your challenge for any one of y'all. If you happen to be Mexican and you've been calling me names, or you just always trying to, ridiculing people that have darker skin, show me a picture of your ass in the 1900s. Prove to me that you were fly like that. Because there's no way in hell slaves supposed to, because you call every black person in Mexico today, they were a descendant of slaves. Show me your ass since you was in power that you was looking that fly. You won't be able to find nothing. And I guarantee it. And that's a fact. So, this is the same thing. I'll show you 3 different pictures, 3 different groups, 3 different pictures, and guess what? The lady in Haiti with her family is looking fly as fuck, and guess what? She was supposed to be a slave. And I'll show you Mexico, the kids looking fly as fuck, they were supposed to be slaves. But I'll show you this, they don't look shit like those other 2. So you understand who really was indentured servant. You really know now who really was not the one running nothing. Okay? So that, now I want you to pay close attention. Pay close attention to the kids in the middle, folks. Look at the dress code. Look at the dress color.
Look up Barbary treaties and understand what's really going on with the peace and friendship treaties. What was really going on in the Barbary treaties? You gotta understand, these were treaties between the United States of America and Morocco, Tunis, Algiers, Tripoli, and that's when the peace and friendship treaty comes into effect as well, around the same time. Well, what was going on? Why was the United States begging for a treaty? Why they need peace and friendship? Well, because when Morocco was seizing their ports and their ships, it was breaking them. They didn't have money. They weren't bringing in any funds. And what was on those ships was slaves. But they want you to think they was melanated slaves. But I don't want to hear another melanated person talking about they are descendant of the slave. Unless you mix with Albion, you gotta understand what the term slave means. The original slaves were Albion people. They were not melanated.
This is one of the emperors of Morocco. This is Ishmael. 1670. One of the emperors of Morocco who was known to have owned several Europeans as slaves. Now, a lot of people who are part of the African community or the African American community are often made to feel somewhat inferior because people say, well, all you all ever did was descend from some slaves. And of course, you can believe that me being in West Virginia, I've had a lot of students, a lot of European American students who come in the classes, expecting to hear about the history of African American enslavement and the history of European Americans being the masters. And of course, I come from another direction. I begin at the beginning. And I deal with the issue of even where the word slave came from. Then we go back to that Slavic thing again, right? See, remember homeboy earlier talking about, the Slavic peoples being less than Homo sapien. Well, yeah, some of the Germanic peoples thought so. That pressed them into servitude so much that their name became synonymous with servitude, hence slave. So when we look at the situation in its entirety, we recognize that no one has a monopoly on being enslaved. The only thing is, in more recent history, African peoples were the most recently enslaved en masse.
Ellis Island, New York, January 1st, 1892. The arrival of the real slaves, the albinos from the Caucasus Mountains.
This is 1903, Ellis Island, New York. The first arrival of the disease-infested undesirables was January 1st, 1892.
So, these are your ancestors. They came here
and
on
these are
ships
the real slaves.
Convicts, vagrants,
let the truth be told,
prostitutes, delinquents, the undesirables. These Albions signed indenture agreements, which meant that they could not own the land. The slave codes and the Christian codes actually applied to these people. And what is so crazy is how the Albions have tried to...
The Irish slave trade of the forgotten white slaves. Human cargo transported on British ships bound for the Americas. They were shipped by the hundreds.
There were white and black indentured servants in 1619. They got along. Poor whites from England, blacks together, and when they ran away together, somebody said, that's a problem. They're getting along. We can have a class riot, we cannot have a race riot because we're the class. Sorry, we can have a race riot, not a class riot, because we're the class. So that's when they said indentured servants white, you get 2 more years. You're in charge of the blacks. Blacks, you get life. That's the beginning of slavery. There is your caste system. This, don't trust me. The word white, the racial word white is completely made up. In the early 1600s. The world's 5 billion years old, people. Neanderthal life, 200 million years old. Modern life, 160 million, 200 million years old. Modern enlightenment, 6,000 years ago. 3,000 years for Jesus. But the word white was created 400 years ago, here, so that he was messed up in the head.
Did you know nearly 40% of enslavers in parts of the American South were women? We've all heard about the men who ran the slave trade, but the role of white women, completely hidden. They bought, sold, punished, and profited, and history conveniently left them out of the story. Based on the shocking research from historian Christine Walker, this is the truth they didn't teach you in school.
Did you know white slaves were sold in the 17th century more than blacks in America, with a staggering death rate between 37% to 50%? This is the story the history books will not tell you, nor will they teach it in school. Irish and black slaves were shipped to the sugar plantations in Barbados. Modern-day historians call the white slaves indentured servants, and they never refer to them as slaves. These white slaves had to work 14 hours a day with no wages in the worst working conditions, equivalent to the same harsh, hard labor that existed in the...
Yo, somebody's been lying, but we're about to get to the bottom of it. TikTok. I know. This is for entertainment purposes only. Let me slide one time, alright? Just let me do my thing. Don't worry about what I'm doing over here. This is for entertainment purposes only. This is just a theory. I'm not saying that this is true. I just want y'all to hear me out and tell me what y'all think. Alright? It's just a theory. Some of the events are true, though. Some of these things did happen. Like this. This did happen. Alright? They didn't teach you about this in high school. But there's a lot of crazy things that are going on in history that nobody seems to know about. Or nobody wants to talk about. But we're going to bring the truth out. Because it's just that age, right? It's time for this. There's resets that happen. The timeline is jacked up and we all know it, right? We know that they change history. We heard of the phantom time hypothesis. I got a whole video about it where they changed thousands of years of history, okay? And it's all a lie. History is a complete lie for that guaranteed amount of time that they changed history and made up history, all right? I want you to watch this video real quick and then we'll get right back into it, okay?
Welcome, and thank you for joining me for today's exploration into orphan trains, completing the reset. The objective of today's exploration is to consider the role the orphan trains played in the last reset. And this is one of the theories that we consider the most plausible, the 5 eras theory. Breaking down the entirety of human existence into 5 distinct eras that were separated by hard resets. The Golden Age comprising the first 3 eras, and then the Tartarian Age, or the age that preceded ours, whatever you want to call it, the civilization that we believe was across all the lands that came before us. Then we had a hard reset, and the year on that hard reset we debate. Was it 1850, 1800, and 1750? And that brought us into our contemporary age, or the current time frame that we have many unique and creative names for, such as the age of plastic, the age of disposability, and the age of many different alluring historical narratives. What we're looking at here, though, is the time frame immediately following 1850, which is when we believe the last reset occurred. And we're going to look specifically at how that reset was implemented. It looks like there were 3 distinct approaches that were used: conflict, assimilation, indoctrination, and typically in that chronological order.
Alright, so they talked about a reset. They talked about a timeline, they talked about a reset, and the timeline they gave was 1860s, right? The 1860s, okay? Which is important, imperative, right? So between the 1860s and the 1900s, mid-1900s, they had the orphan children, these children who were getting sent all around the world, right? All around America, right? To work on farms, begging people to take these children in, right? Open your doors, please. Somebody take these people in. But I think there's a sinister plot. And I think that that's the reason why you only hear about one half of history. And the rest is just completely wiped out. Right? I believe, based on my research, that slavery was not just a white and black thing, as in white people in power and black people enslaved. What my research is showing me, that it was a multi-ethnic thing going on. And all different kind of people were enslaved. And all different kind of people were free. All at one time. It just so happens that after the reset, a certain kind of people ended up being at the top. And I won't even say they're at the top. I'll just say that they're the spokesperson. That they're the visual for what the top is. But it's possible that we all had humble beginnings. The color line that was drawn after the reset really set us up. When I was young, there used to be depictions like this, and me and all my friends would talk about, oh man, if they gave me the opportunity to shave the master, that would be his last day on earth. Blah, 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 blah. Now, what if something like that was to have taken place, but they make you think it's something different? What if they did get tired? What if they did have an uprising? And what if that uprising looked like this? Pay attention to these timelines and watch this. In 1910, nearly 1 million black farmers in the U.S. owned a total of 15 million acres. By 1969, they held only 6 million acres. In 1920, blacks owned 14% of the nation's farms. Today, there are only 18,000 black farmers, representing less than 1% of all farms. And this is according to Michelle E. Lee's work in the Roots. All right? This is only a theory. But my, how the tables may have turned. They didn't teach you about this in high school. The colonies had white servants and slaves, all right, who were mostly felons. They were coming from England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, but many were pardoned and recruited to fight in the wars. These wars that spanned from the 1600s well into the 19th century. But who were they fighting? They were fighting the dark copper-colored tribes of North America. And that right there is $5,000 worth of information. But why stop there? They are of dark color, not much unlike the Ethiopians. Wow. But what about the other people they found? Good question. You must mean the people of dark skin, like the others. But remember, color is prima facie evidence that the party bearing the color of Negro, mulatto, or mestizo is a slave, but the same prima facie result does not follow from the Indian color. All right, here they go. They're splitting you up. Despite there being two different categories of people, they're putting you into one. He is not an African, but one of those Americans called an African, because remember, it's based on the first impression. All right, so no offense to these people, but this is how they were breaking down the categories, all right? That's how it was. It was all based on skin tone. And this lady, she could be either Indian or white, depending on which way she wanted to go with it. But it was based on skin tone, all right? Free Indians and their descendants, unmixed by African blood, are entitled to all the privileges of white men except that of suffrage and office. But listen, the term white or free white man was intended to be used in opposition to the colors resulting from the slave blood. All right, but aren't the Indians and the Negroes classified as slaves? What are the resultant colors that they don't like? Whenever the African taint is removed, all right, and the party can be pronounced white, they get to enjoy the privileges. All right, they're trying to get that out of you. All right, so while everybody's running around trying to be white, all right, later on down the line, they turn you black, right? They turn you into a crayon color, all right? But look, it's the 1800s, late 1800s, and migration and immigration is happening, right? People are coming across. But what are they coming for? Land, of course, you know, but how do you steal land? You use the Dawes rules and become the people. Make them forget who they are. And when I snap my fingers, you'll wake up and be African American.